There's a photograph that exists in a private collection in rural Pennsylvania. It was taken in 1887. In it, 9 children stand in a perfect line outside a farmhouse, their faces blurred by the long exposure time required by cameras of that era. But here's what makes this photograph different from thousands of others like it. When the house was demolished in 1952, they found 11 bodies beneath the floor, 2 more than the photograph showed. 2 children who were never documented, never recorded, never mourned, and this wasn't an isolated incident. This was a pattern. We like to think we know our history. We memorize dates of wars, names of presidents, the rise and fall of empires. But there's another history running parallel to the one in textbooks, a shadow archive of American families. And in that archive, children vanish with a regularity that would make your hands shake if you saw the real numbers. Not kidnapped by strangers, not lost to disease, though disease was often written on the death certificates when certificates existed at all. These children were vanished by the very people who brought them into the world, erased systematically, deliberately, and beneath the floorboards of farmhouses, tenements, and respectable Victorian homes across this country, their small bones waited in the dark for someone to remember they had ever existed. This isn't a story about one family. This is about a practice so common, so woven into the fabric of American domestic life between 1850 and 1920 that it had its own unspoken rules, its own signals that neighbors recognized but never reported. Because to report it would mean admitting they'd seen it before, that they'd looked the other way before, that the floor of their own home might sound hollow if you knocked on it in the right place. The children beneath the floor weren't victims of monsters. They were victims of ordinary people who made calculations about mouths to feed, reputations to protect, and secrets too shameful to let breathe. And what makes this truly haunting is how many of those houses are still standing. How many families still live above spaces they've never thought to examine. How many basements and crawl spaces across America hold answers to questions no one alive remembers asking. The first time this pattern was officially documented was by accident. In 1889, a fire tore through a boarding house in Chicago. When firefighters pulled up the charred floorboards to check for embers, they found something that made the youngest among them walk away from firefighting forever. 17 infants, wrapped in newspaper, stacked like cordwood beneath what had been the landlady's private quarters. The coroner who examined them noted they ranged in age from newborn to approximately 6 months. None showed signs of disease or deformity. They had simply been made to stop breathing, one by one, over the course of several years. The landlady was a widow named Catherine Wells, respectable, attended church every Sunday, and when they arrested her, she didn't deny what she'd done. She just asked them what they expected her to do with babies nobody wanted. That question hung in the air of that courtroom like smoke. Because Catherine Wells wasn't running an isolated operation. She was part of an underground network that spanned every major American city and reached deep into rural communities. They called them baby farms, though that term makes it sound organized, official, when the reality was far more scattered and far more common. These were women, usually widows or spinsters, who took in infants for a fee. Unmarried mothers would pay them to care for a child they couldn't keep. Sometimes the mothers intended to return. Sometimes they paid extra to ensure they never had to see the child again. And the women who ran these operations understood the economics perfectly. A living child required food, clothing, attention. A dead child required only silence and a shallow space beneath the floor. The mothers who handed over their infants weren't all innocent victims of circumstance. Some were. Some were domestic workers impregnated by employers who would fire them if pregnancy showed. Some were young girls ruined by men who promised marriage and delivered shame instead. But others were married women carrying children their husbands would know weren't theirs, or families who'd already reached the edge of starvation and couldn't divide their bread any thinner. The calculation was always the same: this child, or the survival of everyone else. And once that calculation was made, once money changed hands and a baby was carried through a door it would never leave through again, the forgetting began. The mothers forgot. The families forgot. And the women who operated the baby farms knew that the most valuable service they provided wasn't childcare. It was amnesia. But here's what the historical record doesn't want you to understand. This wasn't just happening in Chicago. In 1895, they found 23 children beneath a house in Philadelphia. In 1901, 31 in New York. In 1907, 42 in Boston. And those are just the ones discovered by accident, revealed by fire or demolition or a broken sewer line. How many houses were torn down without anyone looking underneath? How many bodies were scattered when foundations were poured for new buildings? We count the discovered. We don't count the lost. And the lost always outnumber the found. There's a journal entry that survived from 1893, written by a physician named Dr. Samuel Blackwood, who practiced in rural Vermont. He never published it, never showed it to colleagues. It was found in his effects after he died in 1931, tucked inside a medical text on obstetrics. In it, he describes being called to a farmhouse to deliver a child. The mother was unmarried. The father of the child was the woman's own brother. When the infant was born healthy and crying, the family asked Dr. Blackwood to wait in the kitchen. He wrote that he knew what was happening in the other room. He could hear the crying stop. He wrote that when they called him back, the infant was wrapped in a blanket and the mother was asking him what they should do with it. He told them to bury it in the family plot and say it was stillborn. He signed a death certificate listing natural causes. And then he wrote something that cuts through a century of silence. He wrote that this was the 8th time he'd done this. Just on that road. Just in that county. This is what we don't talk about when we romanticize rural American life in the 19th century. The isolation wasn't quaint. It was a cover. When your nearest neighbor lived a mile away and the sheriff lived a day's ride beyond that, your home became its own jurisdiction, its own court, its own place of execution. And the people who held power in those homes, usually fathers, sometimes mothers, made decisions that would never face outside scrutiny. An unmarried daughter becomes pregnant. A married woman bears a child 9 months after her husband has been gone for a year. A family already struggling to survive produces another mouth that cannot be fed. These weren't theoretical problems. They were immediate crises that required immediate solutions. And the solution, more often than history wants to admit, was to ensure that the problem stopped crying. The methods were usually suffocation. Quick, quiet, difficult to prove after the fact, especially in an era when infant mortality from genuine causes was already staggeringly high. A pillow held too long, a hand pressed over a small face until the struggling stopped. Some used laudanum, that opium-laced solution sold freely in every drugstore, given in doses that ensured sleep became permanent. Others simply placed infants in cold rooms and let nature do the work they couldn't bring themselves to do directly. The cause of death would be recorded as pneumonia, as failure to thrive, as any of a dozen medical terms that sounded official enough to forestall questions. And because infant death was so common, because every family expected to lose at least one child, these deaths blended into the background noise of ordinary tragedy. No one investigated, no one questioned, no one counted. But some families couldn't risk even a fraudulent death certificate. Some families needed complete invisibility, so the children went beneath the floor, sometimes immediately, sometimes after being kept alive for weeks or months until the situation became untenable. And here's the detail that makes this unbearable. In many cases, the other children in the family knew. They heard the crying through the floorboards. They watched their parents carry food down into the crawl space. They were told never to speak of their brother, their sister, who lived in the dark place beneath them. And they didn't speak, because children understand threats. They understand that the same door that closes on a sibling can close on them. So they learned silence. They learned forgetting. And when they grew up and had children of their own, they carried that capacity for silence with them. That willingness to not see what they'd been taught was invisible. In 1912, a woman named Margaret Hayes was arrested in Baltimore after neighbors reported a smell coming from her basement. When police entered, they found 3 children alive, malnourished, filthy. One of them had been living in that basement for 4 years. But here's the part that stopped the investigation cold. Margaret Hayes wasn't a stranger who'd kidnapped these children. She was their mother. The children had been born, lived briefly upstairs as part of the family, and then at some point, each had been moved down into the dark. When asked why, Margaret couldn't articulate a reason that made sense to the officers questioning her. She said they'd become difficult, that she'd had too many, that she'd needed them to be quiet. The oldest child, a girl of 7, told investigators she couldn't remember what the son looked like. She'd been 4 when she went down into the basement. 3 years in the dark. And the thing that haunted the social workers who took these children into care wasn't just the abuse itself. It was that Margaret Hayes had 4 other children who lived upstairs, normal children who attended school and played in the yard, who walked across the floor above their siblings every single day and said nothing. This reveals something we desperately don't want to understand about family structures in this period. The family unit wasn't sacred in the way we pretend it was. It was a hierarchy, and in that hierarchy some children were deemed valuable and some were deemed expendable. The factors that determined value varied. Sometimes it was legitimacy. A child born within marriage had value. A child born from adultery or rape or incest did not. Sometimes it was gender in farming communities where sons could work the land. Sometimes it was health. A disabled child, a sickly child, a child who required extra resources. These could be recategorized from family member to burden. And once that recategorization happened, once a child moved from the category of person to the category of problem, the solutions became unthinkable. Except people thought them, and enacted them, and then served dinner upstairs while the problem remained in the dark below. The legal system of the time offered almost no protection. Child welfare laws were nearly non-existent before the 1920s. The concept that children had rights separate from their parents was radical, controversial, seen as government overreach into the sacred domain of the family. Parental authority was absolute. What happened inside a home was private, and privacy, that word we use to mean dignity and autonomy, also meant cover. It meant that a father who decided a child shouldn't exist could make that decision without interference. It meant that a mother who couldn't cope had options that didn't involve asking for help, because asking for help meant admitting failure, and failure meant social death in communities where reputation was survival. There's a phrase that appears in multiple documents from this era, in court records and newspaper accounts and private letters. They would say a child had been put away, not put up for adoption, not sent away to relatives, put away, as if the child were an object that no longer served a function. And sometimes put away meant an asylum or an orphanage, but often it meant exactly what it sounded like. The child had been put in a place where they would never be found, where they would never complicate the family narrative again, where they would decompose slowly in the dark while life continued in the light above them. And the families who did this weren't outliers. They weren't the exceptions that proved the rule. They were the rule that we've spent a century pretending was an exception. Because if we admitted how common this was, we'd have to confront what that says about the foundation our families are built on. Literally and metaphorically. By 1915, social reformers were beginning to document this pattern systematically. A woman named Florence Kelly conducted surveys in major American cities, going door to door in tenement districts, asking about infant mortality rates. What she discovered wasn't just shocking in its numbers, it was shocking in its acceptance. Women told her openly about babies who died, but when pressed for details, the stories didn't hold together. Infants who'd supposedly died of disease but were never seen by a doctor. Children who were buried in unmarked graves that family members couldn't quite locate. And in her private notes, Kelly wrote that she'd begun to recognize a specific kind of silence. Not the silence of grief, but the silence of complicity. These women knew what had happened to their neighbors' children, and their neighbors knew what had happened to theirs. It was a mutual agreement not to examine too closely, not to ask questions that might require answers no one wanted to give. Kelly's work led to the first real push for child protection laws, for mandatory reporting of births and deaths, for welfare checks and outside intervention in family affairs. And she was hated for it. Churches preached against her. Newspapers called her a destroyer of family values, because what she was really threatening wasn't just the practice of infanticide. She was threatening the architecture of silence that held communities together. In neighborhoods where everyone was barely surviving, where poverty made monsters of ordinary people, that silence was a form of mercy. If you reported your neighbor could report you. If you testified about what you'd heard through thin walls, someone else could testify about what they'd heard through yours. So no one testified, no one reported, and the children kept disappearing beneath floors that everyone walked across without acknowledging what lay underneath. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? If you discovered that your great-grandmother had put a child beneath the floor, would you tell that story? Would you dig up that floor? Or would you do what most families did, what most families still do, and simply decide that some history is better left buried? Because here's where this gets personal. Here's where it stops being a historical curiosity and becomes a question you need to ask about your own family tree. Genealogists run into this pattern constantly. They find birth records that don't match family Bibles. They find census records that list children who disappear by the next census with no death certificate, no explanation, just an absence where a person used to be. They find photographs with children scratched out, faces deliberately destroyed. And when they bring this to families, when they say there's a gap in your history, there's a child unaccounted for, the families almost always say the same thing. They say it must have been infant mortality, natural causes, the hard realities of life back then. And maybe that's true, maybe it is, but the genealogists know to look for patterns. 3 children in a row, all supposedly dying of natural causes between the ages of 6 months and 2 years. 4 daughters born after sons who all vanish from the record. And when they find those patterns, they stop asking questions, because they've learned that families don't want these answers. They want the version of history that lets them sleep at night. There's a house in Ohio that's been in the same family for 5 generations. In 2003, the current owners decided to renovate the basement. They were putting in new plumbing when they found a small wooden box wedged between the foundation stones. Inside were bones, infant bones, and wrapped around the bones was a piece of paper with a name written in faded ink. Sarah, born 1891. No last name, no other information, just Sarah and a year. The family who found this had a choice to make. They could report it to authorities, trigger an investigation, have their family history examined by strangers. Or they could rebury it, put the box back, pour the concrete, pretend they'd never looked. They chose the second option. They told one family member about it, an aunt who did genealogy research. And the aunt found the answer almost immediately. Sarah had been the 8th child of the woman who'd originally owned the house, born 6 months after that woman's husband had left for work in the coal mines of Pennsylvania and never returned. The math wasn't hard to do, and the family never spoke of it again. They finished their renovation. They live there still, and Sarah remains in her box in the foundation, a secret that 3 living people carry and will probably take to their graves. This is happening right now. Not the infanticide, though we'd be naive to think that's entirely stopped, but the discovery, the choice, the burial of the burial. Because residential construction hasn't stopped. Old houses are constantly being torn down, renovated, examined in ways they weren't designed to withstand. And the things that were hidden in haste, buried in shame, sealed behind walls and floors and foundations, those things keep emerging. Most don't make the news. Most are handled quietly, privately, exactly the way the family in Ohio handled it. A call is made to a family lawyer instead of the police. A private reburial is arranged. The story becomes a whispered piece of family lore, told only to the most trusted members, and even then only in fragments. Because to tell the whole story would be to admit complicity. Not in the original act, but in the ongoing cover-up. And that's the thing about these secrets. They don't have a statute of limitations on shame. Archaeological digs in urban areas have started finding these remains more frequently as cities tear down old neighborhoods to build new developments. In Philadelphia alone, between 2010 and 2020, construction projects unearthed the remains of over 200 infants and young children that couldn't be connected to any known cemetery or burial ground. They were found under houses, under streets, under what used to be alleyways between tenements. The protocol is to document them, attempt to determine cause of death when possible, and re-enter them in a common grave. But the documentation is limited. There's no investigation unless evidence of recent crime is present. And bones from the 19th century don't tell investigators much beyond age at death and sometimes signs of trauma. They can't tell you who the child was. They can't tell you who made the decision. They can't tell you how many others are still buried in places no one's thought to look. There are historians who believe we've found less than 10% of these children. That the real number, the true scope of this practice, is so large that if it were fully documented, it would fundamentally change how we understand American family history. It would force us to recognize that the nuclear family, that sacred institution we're told is the bedrock of American values, was also a killing floor. That the privacy we fought so hard to protect around the family unit also protected patterns of violence that would make the most hardened criminal investigators struggle to maintain composure. And maybe that's why we don't look. Why we accept the official narratives, the natural causes, the innocent explanations. Because the alternative is too destabilizing, too confronting, too much like looking in a mirror and seeing something we don't want to recognize as our own reflection. So what do we do with this knowledge? How do we hold it? Because you can't unhear what you've heard in the last 30 minutes. You can't unknow that children were systematically erased from American families for generations. That the houses we inherit, the land we build on, the family stories we tell ourselves, all of it might be standing on a foundation of small bodies we've agreed not to mention. Some of you are going to close this video and never think about it again. That's a choice. That's the same choice communities made for 100 years. But some of you are going to start asking questions. You're going to look at your family tree differently. You're going to wonder about the gaps, the inconsistencies, the children who appear in one census and vanish by the next. And if you find something, you're going to face the same choice that family in Ohio faced. Report it and tear open wounds that have been scarred over for generations, or rebury it and carry the knowledge alone. There's no moral clarity here. That's what makes this so difficult. We want to believe we would have been different, that we would have spoken up, intervened, saved those children. But we're making that judgment from a position of safety and plenty that most people in that era never experienced. When you're watching your living children starve, when you're one pregnancy away from destitution, When the choice is between feeding the family you have or adding another mouth you can't feed, the moral calculations become brutal. That doesn't make it right. It makes it human. And humans, when pushed to the edge of survival, are capable of things that would horrify them in moments of safety. The women who ran baby farms weren't demons. The parents who placed children beneath floors weren't monsters. They were people in impossible situations making impossible choices. And the fact that we've built a society where those situations are less common now doesn't mean we've evolved beyond the capacity for those choices. It means we've insulated ourselves from the circumstances that would test us. The children beneath the floor are still there, in houses across America, under foundations that will outlast everyone alive today. And they're not ghosts in the way we tell ghost stories. They're not haunting anyone. They're just absent, forgotten, erased from history except in moments like this when someone decides to remember them. To say their names when names are known. To acknowledge that they existed, that they mattered, that they deserved more than a shallow grave beneath the place where their families ate dinner and celebrated holidays and pretended everything was fine. This isn't about judgment. It's about witness. Someone needs to know what happened. Someone needs to carry the knowledge forward. Because if we let this history disappear completely, then those children die twice. Once in the dark beneath the floor, and again in the forgetting. You're going to walk differently in old houses now. You're going to hear floors creak and wonder. You're going to see gaps in family histories and question. And that discomfort, that inability to look at American domestic life the same way, that's the cost of knowing. Some knowledge can't be contained. It spreads, it changes you, it makes you see the world as it actually was, not as we've agreed to pretend it was. The forgotten children beneath the floor are not forgotten anymore, not by you. And now you carry them forward, in the questions you ask, in the stories you choose to tell or not tell, in the way you understand that every family history has chambers we've sealed off, spaces we've agreed not to enter, truths too heavy to hold in daylight. But they're there, they've always been there, and now you know where to look.